Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for joining our panel at Center for Geopolitics Indo-Pacific program. Today, this is the second panel on ASEAN and Timor-Leste, which we more focus on sociological, historical perspective in the post-conflict society in Timor-Leste. And my name is Takahiro Kamisuna from the research assistant at Center for Geopolitics and also PhD student at the Center of Development Studies, University of Cambridge. Today we have two, including myself, three distinct speakers from Malaysia and Timor-Leste and myself from Japan, discussing the kind of relation between ASEAN and Timor-Leste. So ASEAN, Timor-Leste was admitted to join the ASEAN's membership, but the relation between ASEAN countries and Timor-Leste is quite in some point it's quite controversial. At some point it's quite have like problematic in a way that we have a conflict between Timor-Leste and Indonesia, and then ASEAN response to that kind of conflict is quite it's not really it's not really positive sometimes. So, but given those historical context, we have many topics on discussing in relation between Timor-Leste and ASEAN, including social movement, human rights activism, or post-conflict society stuff. So today, three of us will talk about each presentations on relation between ASEAN and Timor-Leste, and we will have some discussion and Q&A. So let me introduce the speaker first. So we have three speakers. First, Dr. Ying Hooi from the Associate Professor at Head of Department of International Strategic Studies at the University of Malaya. We talk about the general view on the relation between ASEAN and Timor-Leste. And then second speaker, myself, Takahiro, I'm a PhD student, again, at Center of Development Studies. So I'm gonna talk about more like kind of historical context from 1990s, how ASEAN's civil society movement supported the Timor-Leste independence struggle. So I kind of showed how not only like state-oriented view, but also how civil society have been engaging in the conflict issues in Timor-Leste. And then third speaker, Ariel, the doctor student from Hawaii University, NOAA. We talk more about like this, the relation between ASEAN and Timor-Leste from the East Timorese perspective. So I would do, let me just stop these screens. Right, so first speaker, I think it's, the table is for you, so please start your talk as you like.
Thank you very much, Taka, for the introductions, also to the Center for Geopolitics in inviting me to this seminar on ASEAN and Timor-Leste, socio-historical perspective in the post-conflict societies. So today what I will be presenting, will be focusing on this Timor-Leste and ASEAN, basically Timor-Leste's admission to ASEAN from the more of the Southeast Asian view on what are the contested views in terms of understanding each other, as well as what are the problems, as well as the prospects. As rightly pointed out by Taka just now in the introductions, the admission of Timor-Leste into ASEAN is a long journey comparing to many others ASEAN existing members. While I would say perhaps it is not entirely harmonious due to the long wait, and there are several reasons that I can actually explain this. And at the same time as well, I think what can be discussed later is really the understanding of this regional grouping, ASEAN, as well as the small states, countries, Timor-Leste in these topics. So I'm going to start with by looking at Article 6 of the ASEAN Charter that is being put in force in 2008 of the admission of the new members. So the reason why I'm putting this up, because this is one of the contested views as well in terms of why Timor-Leste is being subjected to a lot of criteria just in order to be admitted as the ASEAN member states, despite of their applications since their restoration of independence. And there were many false hope being given to Timor-Leste during the journey of their admissions. And if you look at the Article 6, bullet number 2, admission shall be based on the following criteria, that is location in the recognized geographical region of Southeast Asia, recognition by all ASEAN member states, agreement to be bound and to abide by the charter, as well as ability and willingness to carry out the obligation of membership. So if we look at this, I think one of the last steps that the Timor-Leste has fulfilled is actually to open up all the embassies in all the 10 ASEAN member states. However, as we know, there were many roadshows and fact-finding missions that were conducted to actually ask Timor-Leste to prove that they are able to actually carry out the obligations here. So with these long journeys, naturally the frustrations comes in from Timor-Leste, which is totally understandable, whereby the question is really, if we have, referring to Timor-Leste, have fulfilled these 4 criteria, what's stopping us? And even now, looking at this, the ASEAN leaders' statement on the application of Timor-Leste for ASEAN membership, the latest news in November 2022, they are admitted in principle as the member, but they are not yet there, but they are almost there. So, but what's very interesting to look at these 2 press statements is that, because when we look at the lens of the socio-historical, we have to really understand how ASEAN is being formed, why is it being formed, as well as how Timor-Leste achieved their restoration of independence, and with all the historical evolutions as well. So during my observations, I believe that these 2 understanding of the background of the regional grouping ASEAN and to understand the background of Timor-Leste is missing. Hence, it contributes to a lot of contested views and the challenges that are currently happening. So if you look at this ASEAN leaders statement, basically, and this is more or less the way that, you know, if you look at the ASEAN statements, even the very contentious one, the 5-point consensus on Myanmar, ASEAN normally leave the issues being open. But if you look at the response by Timor-Leste, which on the screen, they have mentioned, we request the ASEAN member states to grant full membership to Timor-Leste in 2023, following 11 years of preparation and the adoption of the roadmap and report to the 42nd ASEAN Summit. So there is a deadline that 2023. But if you look at the 5-point consensus, there was really, you know, the language is very different. So this, by looking at the different types of statements, had shown there are some diversities that we are witnessing actually between this Timor-Leste as well as the ASEAN, which contributed to the contested views that I'll be discussing shortly. I took a little bit time of trying to search of how people actually respond to the announcement by the ASEAN leaders in November 2022, when Timor-Leste is being admitted to ASEAN in principles. So I couldn't find any posters coming from Timor itself, if I might have overlooked it, but so far, as I tried to search it, but I couldn't find. But what's very interesting is that there's a lot of posters coming from Indonesia, different news portals, some independent, some online news portal and so forth, welcoming Timor-Leste to ASEAN with some backgrounds and so forth, which I believe is very useful and also very interesting for us to see from the lens of social historical perspective, especially the relationship between Timor-Leste and Indonesia itself. So I would like to draw your attention to these posters that put it as ASEAN bonded as one, with the different years of admissions by different ASEAN member states here. So the reason why is that this will then go back to my focus here on these 3 points, specifically on the contested views and the challenges. First views that I would like to discuss is really about the socio-historical linkage with the geopolitics, the so-called new regionalisms. I think one of the lack of understandings between ASEAN and Timor-Leste is really about the emergence of ASEAN itself and the independence of Timor-Leste itself, to understand how that country is being formed after the occupations by the Indonesia. So if we look at ASEAN, and I would like to focus on the narratives of the emissions of Brunei in 1984 and 1995, we have the Vietnam joining the ASEAN, and 1997, we witnessed Laos and Myanmar joining the ASEAN, and the latest 1999 was Cambodia, although Cambodia was supposed to join together with Myanmar and Laos in 1997. So if we look at how Brunei joined ASEAN right after it obtains the full sovereignty over its external affairs, means when it achieved the independence. Yeah, but if you look at Vietnam, Vietnam took a little bit time after the independence to join the ASEAN, whereby the decisions to join ASEAN is really a result of Vietnam being opened up from their communist parties in terms of the foreign relations, that including renewed of the view of looking at what happens within the from the geopolitical lens. And the Myanmar and Laos itself, following the Vietnam's joining the ASEAN, was quite interesting, because one of the motivation was really the Vietnam's full admissions to ASEAN itself, being basically, you know, geographical considerations. And also, it is for the case of Laos, for example, it is not really choice, but it is really important to be part of this big region at that point of times, especially during just right after the post-Cold War scenarios. So all these different countries are admitted as the ASEAN member states based on differences, although they have differences. And this is particularly very interesting because the contested views coming from Timor itself is that why should Timor-Leste join ASEAN, which ASEAN is not democratic? ASEAN has the principles of non-interference that might not do well with the democracy systems in Timor-Leste itself. But if we look at the emissions of the Vietnam's CMLF, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, and Vietnam, as well as Brunei, they join ASEAN by having all these diversities and not sharing really the common grounds, especially in terms of some with the language, the cultures, and many other things as well. But one thing that is important is really the importance of politics as well as the securities. And of course, moving forward, it is also the economic consideration, which is almost the similar things for why Timor-Leste, it is important for Timor-Leste to be part of ASEAN as well. These new regionalisms I would like to really discuss a little bit more is about, now we are no longer just having ASEAN, but we also have not longer talking about Southeast Asia region, but we are also talking about Indo-Pacific. And Indo-Pacific, whether you like it or not, it is a new buzzwords that being discussing and debating around. And I believe these contested views of even in the Southeast Asia itself, Indo-Pacific is quite still debatable. You know, some countries are comfortable to actually use the term, but some countries, for example, like Malaysia, this particular term is still being seen as, you know, there's a neutral approach into this term. And I believe in this contemporary context and the globalizations, Timor-Leste as a post-conflict small state, it would be very important for it to be included into all these kind of bigger regionalisms in order for the mutual benefits and so forth as well. So that's one of the contested views coming from the two different entities. The second point is the identity dilemma. I think there's a lot of literatures that are being written about Timor-Leste is still seeking for its identity, nation in the making, as well as I think in a broader sense that fits into this seminar is the regional identity. What is the regional identities really from Timor? And if you read the Timor documents, government documents, ASEAN is the priorities in their strategic plannings. And it has been like this for many years, and it has always been the priorities. So, but there are also views about what is really the ASEAN way that we are talking about. ASEAN way basically also refers to the norms and the principles that actually guided ASEAN. But if you look at the ASEAN approach, that is consensus, non-interference and so forth, and by using the dialogue, I believe this is something that all the ASEAN member states somehow kind of already get used to it and are using it, and similarly for the Timor-Leste as well. But there was really lack of understanding from ASEAN about Timor, and there was also lack of understanding from Timor about how ASEAN actually work. So that brings up to my third point here. There's also these popular views about East Timor-Leste being democratic, a hindrance, or is somehow to being seen as a threat coming from the ASEAN. Well, I must say this is irrelevant view, because looking at how CMLV and Brunei and even the existing founding members of ASEAN, whether a country is democratic or it is authoritarian is never really something that is being the major considerations, because what ASEAN really preach in this ASEAN way is really the non-interference and so forth. But if you look at the breakthrough, the current one, to look at the Myanmar, I believe Timor has got themselves into quite a bit of issues because of their votes, abstentions towards Myanmar at the United Nations, as well as I think the most recent one is the civil societies groups that wanted to discuss actually really the Myanmar issues by having the Myanmar in Dili itself. So I think all these different controversies and debates really coming from the lack of understanding of each other's that contribute to the contested views. So and this is also quite similar during the back then the times that there was also debates about why Vietnam's are qualified of joining the ASEAN, but at that time there was no ASEAN charters that actually really set out Article 6 that's setting up all the criterias to in order to become an ASEAN. Because if you recall, in the past, Sri Lanka has intention to actually say they wanted to join ASEAN, Papua New Guinea, and many others countries that across the region as well. So I think from the Southeast Asian views, there was definitely very much lack of understanding about Timor-Leste, because from the socio-historical perspective and also in a more contemporary context, the discussions about Timor-Leste is very much lacking in almost all of the ASEAN member states. But at the same time, I think in Timor itself, there's also very much lacking of the knowledge about how ASEAN really work, or about the Southeast Asia as well. But that, of course, is a learning in process for the both. And in whose benefits is my really my final points here, that or whether of course the from the Timor-Leste's government's statements, it has clearly stated that there should be a full membership in 2023, which certainly a lot of stakeholders hope there will be no delay, because that in principle status is really unclear. But however, Timor-Leste has been participating in most of the ASEAN meetings and so forth, and making the presence. So I think moving forwards, looking at all these different challenges, the prospects will be really to build up the understanding of both, because bearing in mind language is, of course, one of the main challenge, but however, it is not unique, because it is the same case with Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, which in some of the countries, they still continue to be more comfortable not using English, but rather their own national language. And those kind of challenges actually still continue within the ASEAN itself in various platforms. So I think the immediate prospects will really be from the education's perspective, that the understanding and knowledge about what is ASEAN really about and what is Southeast Asia from the Timor-Leste universities, and of course from the Southeast Asia. There have been attempts, however, there's really some sort of limited understandings and the knowledge and the experts that really working on the Timor-Leste that should be actually being enhanced as well. I think I'm gonna end here and look forward for the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right. It's a fascinating presentation focusing on the broader context of ASEAN and then Timor-Leste. Enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Okay, the next speaker is actually myself. Let me share my screen. So my presentation focused more on a little bit more of historical context on the relation between ASEAN and Timor-Leste, and also especially over the independence struggle of Timor-Leste for the 24 years. So my kind of starting point is that we often talk about ASEAN values, ASEAN way, its ideological ground, and then if you look at the literature of Southeast Asian politics, international relations, ASEAN's, we have the kind of unique value of ASEAN values against Western value of democracy, human rights. And indeed, not all, but some ASEAN countries have achieved a tremendous economic development and industrialization with a democracy, right? And this is kind of the core value, in ASEAN's membership. But my question is, how about like civil society activism within ASEAN? We have informed of like the student activism, youth activism in each country. Like we have many literatures, much of literatures on Indonesian student movement, and also in the Philippines and Malaysia, like human rights activism against the state rule. But each those kind of piece of work is really scattered in different countries. So my view is I want to try to just make all different kind of social movement together, and in particular, the case of international solidarity movement for the Timor-Leste, East Timorese struggle is quite bring about like really empirical variable and theoretical transparent argument in the role of civil society in ASEAN. And actually, like most of the literature focus on state role in ASEAN membership, but not really about civil society movement, transnational movement in ASEAN. So in my talk, I just focus on this quite unique consortium, like platform called Asia Pacific Coalition for East Timor, which hold a conference in Manila in 1995, Kuala Lumpur 1996, and then Bangkok actually in Bangkok 1998. So it's my typo, but yeah. So this is like a international regional conference hosted by the human rights activists, student activists in each country to support the East Timorese struggle for independence. And it's quite interesting because when it comes to like a human rights issue and nationalism, those two ideas looks quite opposite or different, but sometimes we could find a kind of interplay between those two ideas. For instance, back in 1950s, when the most of the so-called third world country tried to gain independence from the Western colonialism, and the diplomats from those countries try to put the rights of self-determination as a part of human rights. And more contemporary, like human rights advocacy is a transnational force against state power, or we could say weapon of the weak, for those who are oppressed by the regime. So we kind of have this kind of different idea whether self-determination and human rights to be quite related, but also human rights advocacy itself is more like universal or supra-state national force, political force, social force. So I think it might be quite too. It might be the past, but like we might need to start from the end of the imperialism, colonialism, in Bandung Conference in 1955 in Indonesia. So here, the Sukarno, president of Indonesia, he declared the end of the colonialism. They are no longer the victim of colonialism. And the so-called the third world in Asia and the African countries kind of commit to claim their own rights of self-determination against Western imperialism. So that is a kind of starting point in so-called in the third world country that trying to make the rights of independence, right of self-determination into the human rights advocacy. But over the Cold War, we see the kind of transition from imperialism to the empire, which Michael Hart and Antonio Negri defined. So I think some of you might familiar with the term, but basically the empire is characterized fundamentally by the lack of boundaries. Emperor's rule has no limit. So while Western imperialism had a specific boundaries or territory or colonies, but empire is more like borderless. And some people like to say this kind of empire is more like a transnational, international phenomena, and actually human rights NGO is a part of that kind of mechanism that's promoting the imperial emperor's ideology on human rights protections. But it's quite a fluid idea to understand the relation between the state and also international society. But the interesting is that after the empire became quite visible, and also the other counter argument of multitude in which they fight against empires, capitalist empire. But those kind of analytical scope allow us to understand how human rights diffused in different countries in the world, and also how each social activists in different countries were able to link to the other activism in another countries. So I think I'm kind of using the kind of framework to understand how nationalism and human rights could be linked over the issue of the independence of East Timor, especially in 1990s. In 1990s, we have a bunch of as many activism in Timor-Leste, and also after the Santa Cruz massacre in 1991, where Indonesian military fired the youth demonstrator in Dili in Timor-Leste. So international attention became really visible toward the East Timor conflict and so-called issue of East Timor. And East Timor became the issue of human rights, or humanitarian crisis, or human rights issue among the international communities. So I kind of compare the context between Bandung and Timor-Leste in 1950s when Indonesia and also other Southeast Asian countries gained independence from Western colonialism, and in 1990s when the Timor-Leste became more human rights issue. So we could see how the different kind of points of in 1950s, the self-determination as a first right is claimed by the third world countries, including Indonesia, but it's always denied by the Western countries, which kind of ideology or aspirations, national aspiration against the Western colonialism to gain independence and to try to make their own nations. International community was not happy with that because the most of predominant powerful state are not happy with incorporating the idea of self-determination into human rights. So they always use the humanitarian crisis rather than human rights issues, and during the Cold War context. But in 1990s, the world order have completely changed, right? We have this kind of also different actors. While self-determination in Bandung was proclaimed by the diplomat nationalist leaders, 1990s, those rights for self-determination was claimed by the human rights activists, students, also social nationalists, those like so-called non-state actors, I would say, and against dictatorship, authoritarian regime. And this was really supported by the international community because in 1990s post-Cold War context, human rights issue is quite important agenda in the world. And as East Timor case was actually incorporated into this post-Cold War dynamics, in which the 1990 Ndidi Santa Cruz massacre rhetorically placed the issue of East Timor within the historical cases of humanitarian crisis in the post-Cold War period, including Rwanda, Kosovo, Iraq, and West Bank among the left avenues. So this is how over the 1990s, East Timor's conflict in East Timor became human rights issue, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in the international community. And in this context, it is in this context that Asian Pacific Coalition for East Timor was established. Firstly, in Manila in 1994, and quite many social activists, human rights activists from Manila joined this conference. And then I quote a couple of things, but I think most interesting fact is that I just highlight in red, but the conference held in many countries to support the Philippine struggle for democracy. How could we not support the East Timorese when our own freedom was gained with international solidarity? So this is one of the personal account from the event. So this is how, because Philippines also experienced the colonial struggle against Spanish and American colonialism, and also itself in 1986, Philippines has these Edosa revolutions against Marcos dictatorship. So that kind of social activism within the Philippines is kind of trying to resonate with the student or youth activism in Timor-Leste. And also, Indonesian human rights activist Rashid Nasidik, he came to Manila for this conference, and he quoted the 1945 Constitution of Indonesia, which is defined, status of the nation states against the Dutch colonialism. He said, like, our constitution said that the independence is the right of all people, and because of that, colonialism must be wiped from the face of the earth. Because it is a conflict between humanity and justice, the people of East Timor must have these rights that are so declared in our constitution. So this is kind of typical way of Indonesian activists who supported the East Timorese struggle to justify what you point out, the injustice of the invasion of Timor-Leste by Indonesian government, because Indonesian constitution in 1945, they write that all nations had a right to be independent, to gain the status of nation states. And if we return into this 1945 constitution, when Indonesia also gained independence from Dutch colonialism, we have to let East Timor to decide their own future, right? So this is kind of the typical logic in the leftist avenues and the human rights avenues in Indonesia. And Rashid Nasidik, one of the most prominent human rights activists from Indonesia, came to Manila to speak on the kind of things. And also another Filipino senator, Berto Tanada, she made a speech titled "The Tragedy of East Timor is Our Own Tragedy." So yeah, Indonesia must understand that 40 years ago is too fault to overthrow the of Dutch colonialism and establish its independence. Yes, the Philippines too, like many other countries of the Asia Pacific, share this history of liberation struggles, which should push it more to help those still fighting for their liberations. So obviously, Philippines, Indonesia as well had this kind of history of liberation against colonialism, and that is something like echo with what happening in Indonesia and East Timor. And some like quote from newspapers, also some personal account in Manila, and also the second Asia Pacific Conference for East Timor in Kuala Lumpur in 1996. There are some quote from here, like for instance, like for those who fight for the anti-Marcos struggle in 1980s in the Philippines, which is a social movement against Marcos dictatorship. They finally overthrew the dictatorship. APSET was the reunion of the people. So those who participated in the anti-Marcos movement in 1986 was kind of like, remember that the vibe, the kind of like aspiration which the Philippine people has in the People Power Revolution, which but by supporting East Timorese struggle of independence. And also the APSET in the Philippines revived a little of excitement of 1986, in which the people power over to the Marcos dictatorship. So this is again that kind of revived the atmosphere in which people in the Philippines also overthrew the dictatorship. And that's why, historically speaking, the Filipino social activists or democratic activists have to support the independence struggle of East Timor. This is how the civil society is engaged from Philippines to the Timor-Leste. And also, like Times newspaper, the conference was a fully fledged democracy since Marcos in 1986 overthrows. And also in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysian human rights advocate held moral responsibility to highlight the East Timor issue in Kuala Lumpur, and as NGO should discuss East Timor in Malaysian soil. This is quite like trying to, also like a Malaysian activist try to internalize the issue of East Timorese into their own nationalist, their own historical struggle. And this is how the kind of APSET conference in Manila, Kuala Lumpur, and later in Thailand, Bangkok, will take place. I think it's never time. Okay, right. I think it's not running time, but this thing the last slide. So yes, and this is what, and then so as I explained, they are the kind of international or transnational engagement of civil society among the Philippines, Thai, Malaysia, Indonesia, and East Timor over the independence struggle of East Timorese. And this is kind of like my analysis more like was more historical, socio-historical. But if I could bring some like implication to the current ASEAN Timor-Leste relation, optimistic view. So I would say that civil society engagement beyond nation could be more like accelerated after we have this kind of linkage between ASEAN and Timor-Leste. ASEAN is, in definition, is the unity of the state, but we can also see how ASEAN could be the unity of the peoples, as I showed in the case in 1990s in Timor-Leste and ASEAN. Where a lot of the Timor-Leste are a new democratic nation, which is still controversial. I mean, they have to understand each other from Timor-Leste point of view and also ASEAN's point of view. But the thing is, we have this enriched history of struggle of human rights and transitional justice, which both some of ASEAN countries and Timor-Leste shared. So that might be the kind of agenda which civil society can share. And also, more importantly, ASEAN value of human rights advocacy in ASEAN. This is what I really want to claim, because as I said in the beginning, the Asian part is more like state-oriented, but we have seen in the case of Timor-Leste, civil society actually actively engaged in supporting Timor-Leste's independence struggle. So it might be the new direction toward decolonizing knowledge production, in which how ASEAN, Southeast Asian civil society can engage, cooperate together to promoting democracy or human rights in Asian context. Okay, thank you. This is my presentation. Thank you very much for hearing. Yes, right. And final speaker, Ariel, is going to talk more about ASEAN's Timor-Leste relationship from East Timorese perspective. Okay, Ariel, table is for you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I don't have a slide, so I'm just gonna try to do my best to go through this. But my discussion today really builds up from Dr. Ying Hooi and both speakers, particularly Dr. Ying Hooi, from the Timor-Leste's perspective, especially from the perspective of the so-called readiness, the narrative of readiness and capacity constraint. And as a to quote Dr. Ying Hooi earlier, the search for state identity has been something that Timor-Leste government has been searching since the independence, right? Like, because having a state identity and having being part of regional institutions sort of affirm like the essence of sovereignty, that we are truly a country now that is seen and respected and recognized by others. And we begin to apply to be a member of ASEAN in 2000. I think like the talk started since independence, but officially we applied to be part of ASEAN in 2011. And I think I was like 12 or 13 at that time, and it was a huge thing. Like the government issue like t-shirts for everybody that like the ASEAN, like we are gonna be part of ASEAN, and like people suddenly realize that like, oh, like we're gonna be part of ASEAN now. Like, what does that even mean, right? Like we are a Timorese, and then now we're ASEAN. There's like a sort of the continuous search for national identity. But like 11 years later, we are finally accepted as in principle as a partial member. We have been granted partial membership. And Ramos Horta, the current president of Timor-Leste, said recently in his visit to Jakarta that it is more difficult. It is easier to enter heaven than to enter ASEAN, right? Like to sort of quote the Bible a little bit, but poke on the fact that it is very, very difficult. And so I want to center my discussion today like around that idea, like why is it so difficult for Timor-Leste to be part of ASEAN? And when you look at the narrative that is pervasive, the prevalent narrative that we see like in that influence public opinion is the idea of readiness, that that we have to be economically ready to be part of ASEAN, and that like the arguments against Timor-Leste joining ASEAN, and the reason why one of the member states continuously veto against Timor-Leste's accession to ASEAN is that we're going to be a burden to the region. And then the people who supported our membership in ASEAN argues that we have the higher democratic index, and therefore like we're people are not going to like that. We're going to use that as a tool to influence the human rights policies or laws in other ASEAN countries. But I argue that this idea of readiness reproduces and essentializes the notion of sovereign transfer, political unification, and instrumentality of regional institutions that they don't quite capture the ASEAN way of regional understanding, that is more on the mutual consensus building. There is no, the ASEAN does not have like a parliament or like a central bank with like a similar currency where there is a sort of like some sort of sovereign transfer that that countries burden the region, because at the end of the day, we still see the ways that ASEAN still function to this day is really through like cooperation that is not like a hard or formal or binding. So I'm going to break down these ideas I just laid out and started with capacity constraints. And I think Dr. Ying Hooi really laid out really well, like why not Timor-Leste and why other states, because that capacity constraint was never a prerequisite for other countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos and Myanmar to enter ASEAN, right? Like, why is it that now Timor-Leste the narrative is that Timor-Leste has to be economically ready, and like we have to have all of these requirements, fulfill all of these requirements, and that was not the way that historically ASEAN was founded. ASEAN was consolidated, through middle powers, and then later in the 90s with the weaker states. And even today, like ASEAN continue to have like a capacity constraint is not something, it continues to be something that still we see that in ASEAN countries, like the way that with the COVID-19, the ASEAN doesn't have like a system a regional system to deal with a global pandemic. And unlike other regional institutions like European Union, ASEAN governed through non-binding ad hoc commissions that are created, but they're not legally binding, right? There are no courts to enforce the ideas, the blueprints that ASEAN adopted. So there are times that a lot of ASEAN cooperation is effective, and there are other times that they're really slow. And some proponents of ASEAN as a regional institution argue that maybe this is what truly makes ASEAN effective, that like we don't need to have hard and formal rules and laws and procedure institutions and procedures, but we work through cooperation, consensus building, and communication. So this capacity constraint that that somehow like one country joining ASEAN, and like I remember there was a discussion that, oh, like we don't want to bail out you. Like there is no system of bailout in ASEAN. ASEAN states did not do a bailout system the way that the European Union does. So this capacity constraint really reproduces a different kind of regionalism that doesn't capture ASEAN. So that's my first argument. There's this book called Asian Design, written by Sadia Pekkanen, that really looked at the ways that to add to this capacity constraint that a lot of cooperation in ASEAN are soft and informal. I think that was the word I was looking for, instead of hard and formal like the Europe. And ASEAN's regional cooperation is very issue specific and result oriented, as opposed to like, we gotta come together as a region and do, only like have one voice. But in ASEAN, states matter a lot, like domestic interests matter. And oftentimes when you see elections, if you pay attention to elections in ASEAN, like ASEAN is actually not a priority. Like people, like that's not part of like the narrative that leaders use in order to gain votes from their electorates, because domestic interests and states matter a lot, and as opposed to like thinking of one regional identity. And then there is the myth of sovereign transfer, and I think Timor-Leste is very quiet on the West Papua issue, right? Like that, and the idea that, and I always find it interesting when there is a lot of the fear, like, and that Dr. Ying Hooi presented earlier, that like we're more democratic and we're bringing that democracy to ASEAN, and I do not think so, because there are a lot of issues in Timor-Leste, and it is already the leaders are still domestic interest. I think for this decade and the next decade is going to be more important for Timor-Leste, and all of the our ambition to join the regional institutions is really, at the end of the day, is to enhance our economic strengths. Like we're still 20 years later, like a post-conflict developmental state. Like we're still building the nation, and the idea that somehow we are meddling with other countries, there are no evidence to point to that, because ASEAN has strong non-interference policy that sometimes sometimes ASEAN states do break that rule, but most of the times ASEAN states are very protective of that non-interference policy. So and one of the things that Ramos Horta said in his visit to Indonesia, and really he was showing his frustration, because he was saying that like it was easier for Romania and Bulgaria to enter the European Union than for Timor-Leste to ever enter ASEAN. And I think that the focus of readiness really infuriatingly dominating the conversation of Timor-Leste's ASEAN membership, but it fails to account for the idea of ASEAN centrality as a regional organization, its distinct approach to leadership and cooperation, and its own capacity constraints to continue to hamper regional cooperation. But this failure is part of a larger conversation that needs to be addressed, and that really captures my presentation for today, that the narrow inquiry to regionalism that continue to use primordial theoretical traditions and Eurocentrism has clouded the judgments of a lot of so-called agents of public opinions who dominate platforms through their writings and public opinions. And even when their opinions are not necessarily accurate, they really they're powerful. They ultimately find their way to shape important decision making in the region. So I think that because of the way ASEAN is constructed, it means that as scholars we need to look at ASEAN in a more sophisticated way, instead of thinking of ASEAN as a political unity that doesn't quite capture the identity of the region. So I'll stop there, and happy to engage more with questions and more discussions. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ariel, for fascinating talk. Right. Okay. I think we can just have some brief discussions, and then for the audience, if you have a question, you can post a question in Q&A function on Zoom, or you can also raise your hand, so I can just invite you to the panel, so we can talk directly. So, but before we move to the Q&A, thank you very much for the fascinating talk for both of you. And I really like, since I study more nationalism, social movement in Timor-Leste and other ASEAN countries, I found it's really interesting that how, especially, although the ASEAN is basically economic and political community, but as a community, but when it comes to the regional identity of ASEAN, and for Timor-Leste, East Timorese, I think this is quite interesting, partly because East Timor has long had this kind of cultural attachment to the Portuguese cosmology. I mean, the old generation, the Ramos Horta, and Guzman, they are educated in Portuguese time, and Portuguese is still the one of the public. It's a national language in Timor-Leste, even though most of people cannot speak. But admission to the ASEAN, or more like Southeast Asian, this regionalism might be quite new, because I'm sure the new generations are more exposed to the Indonesian culture or South Asian culture. And so I think this is quite interesting implication because on the one hand, East Timor, the really small state, has to engage in many diplomatic effort, not only with the Portuguese countries, speaking country, but also South Asian country, Indonesia, other countries. But also, if you look at this historical context in which how East Timor is defined between Portuguese cosmologies and also their own relationship to the former Portuguese colonies in Angola, Mozambique. But now we have this kind of cultural, also political connection with South Asian countries. So I just wonder how does this kind of admission of Timor-Leste into ASEAN has the implication to regional identities for both East Timorese and also other countries in ASEAN. So if you have any thought, comment, please share something.
I mean, I could take a stab at that. My thoughts are not organized, but I think identity is very interesting because it does, it is tied to the search for an identity, because even in East Timor, even though we're such a small island, we're made of 4 main indigenous groups, like the Austronesian, the Punak, Pataluku, and I believe Kemak, I think. And then people, the political system used to be very decentralized, but but during the idea of a Timorese, a Timorese identity was constructed as a political unification to unify the whole country. And then we become a Timorese, a Timorese citizens. And then after independence, now there is always initially in the beginning there are a lot of people who thought that we should be part of the Pacific Island countries because ethnically we're Pacific Island countries, so genealogically it makes sense that way. But then some leaders argue, no, we are Southeast Asian, right? So but the Southeast Asian mean suddenly we're Southeast Asian now, so the identity is also constructed to match the geopolitical situation at that time and also now as well. And it's interesting because there are still when choosing Portuguese as official language, the argument that our founding fathers used was that we have Portuguese heritage, and suddenly and that's not true. That was an idea that was imposed and constructed that we are the Portuguese of Asia, some people in Timor like to say that, and that's not necessarily true. And but yeah, so identity is constantly evolving, and sometimes the state's priorities is very different from what people really think. People in Timor-Leste don't wake up and think about ASEAN, right? You think about where their next meal is gonna come from, because we're still one of the impoverished countries in the world. So and the state is really focusing on this ASEAN, and I don't think a lot of people really know what does being part of the ASEAN and Southeast Asia and having Southeast Asia identity even mean.
If I may add, Taka, to what Ariel have responded, is that I think even within, in fact, within the ASEAN itself, with the 10 ASEAN member states, we still continue to struggle with this idea of ASEAN identities. So that's why just now I started my presentations by looking at especially the CMLF. And there's many in the platform that I work on, mostly on human rights and democracies issues. We do continue to have difficulties to have all the 10 ASEAN member states to be present because of the different political systems and the regimes that they are currently having. So not all are on the same page with looking at just based on your presentations on these human rights notions or even the Asian values. In the regions, Asian values has no longer been discussed that much any longer, but rather I think generally the human rights concept itself is remain as rather sensitive in many countries. And in fact, just now also Ariel mentioned about this so-called things about democracy in Timor. Democracy is a very big concept. And I think the misperception is really democracy is solely about civil political rights. But I think the challenge that the Timor has is really developmental rights, which are not being guaranteed. So by not fulfilling the basic needs of the people, they can't tick the box of being a democratic countries. So, but they fulfill other boxes, because what's very interesting is also looking at this ASEAN in a broader ways. There are a lot of comparisons with, looking at the Timor as a small states. And I think that a lot of comparisons trying to make with Singapore, because Singapore is also a small state, but Singapore is hardly being categorized as a democratic countries, but it is in the different dimensions in which civil political rights are not really significant there and is severely being criticized. But on the other hands, they are emerging they are very big economic power. So I think these are the different diversities that really actually contribute to this whole ASEAN identities that in the region itself is still struggle with what is, that's why they come with the ASEAN communities with the 3 pillars. So this ASEAN community talk about people-centered ASEAN, which continue to be criticized. What is really ASEAN, people-centered ASEAN, which remain to be seen that is quite elite-based and a top-down kind of approach. So I think all this, what the Timor-Leste feel is not entirely solo, but it is being felt as some of the other ASEAN member states until today. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much for both of you. I think it's interesting discussions. Yeah, I think it's quite interesting point, because why when you get democracy and also developing life, this is how the most of Asian countries kind of justify and develop. I mean, well, back in like 1970s, 80s, the West authoritarian rule can be justified for the in exchange to the economic development. And then so democracy is not always, I think, the single solutions for those countries. If you look at Myanmar's case, like we still have I have some Myanmar friends, but they also talk like whether democracy is really good for Myanmar or that's still controversial. I mean, with scholars or like international policymakers say West is a failure of democracy, but democracy is not always a good solution for every country in ASEAN. So that is things. And also, I mean, speaking of human rights democracy, what I'm realizing through my research is where people in East Timor or ASEAN country claim human rights, but this is not the same definition of human rights from Western context, because I'm sure they don't really understand what is the international law level, like what is human rights, universal rights. But in the case of civil society movement, like student activists, they claim human rights, but they kind of use that term or terminology of human rights to claim their nationalist aspirations, like nationalism by no means human rights. So I think what I find interesting, even though they use the word democracy or human rights, whatever, something we are familiar with, but actual substance might be quite different in each country. So I think it might be, I mean, for in thinking that kind of regional identity in an ASEAN, which still each country is seeking. But I think the way that how we use that kind of different terminology is also like makes it difficult to understand. But simultaneously, it makes more like open to like the argument discussion how we could actually more newly define the regional identity from existing understanding. So. Cool. Thank you very much. We have actually 2-3 questions from floor. I think I can invite some of them. Daniela, are you happy to talk? I think I can just invite you. Let me try. I think it's more better to be interact. Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Thank you for your questions.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, hello, everyone. Thank you very much. I'm Daniel, lecturer at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, but actually I'm connected from KL. So I'm not sure now, maybe some of you are here. So again, I don't know much. I mean, I deal with ASEAN and Southeast Asia, but I don't know much. That's why I was quite curious about East Timor. Certainly, I can Google and use Google Scholar, but since we're here, I have just a question. Of course, I deal with international relations. So my question is, East Timor, which are the most influential power there? I might imply that Australia as a middle power neighborhood, of course, I guess Indonesia, but I'm wondering about China, the US, or perhaps Japan, which is quite influential. So I'm wondering which are the power that have the most influence there, and if there have been any recent developments that have affected the balance of influence. I don't know. Of course, I imply that China is all over the place, but I might be mistaken. So this is my question. Which foreign powers are there and what are they doing and what is the impact? That's it. Thank you very much. Hope it's clear.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Who want to start the answer? I think I can just start to talk a little bit about. I'm not an expert of geopolitics in Southeast Asian countries, so. But actually, this is a topic we discussed in the previous panel on Tuesday.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we invited like some like the faculties from Australia as well, and Australia's kind of strong diplomatic relation to Timor-Leste. They have a really strong influence, and also we have this argument on how Chinese influence is actually effective or strong. And one of the speakers was the three speakers, they agree that it's kind of exaggerated because, I mean, if you look at this relation between East Asia, Southeast Asia countries and Japanese, and if you look at this relation from East Asian point of view, the China seems really stronger, but what they discussed was actually, it doesn't have so much as like substantial effect to the Timor-Leste. Well, also like because the way the East Timorese politicians use the rhetoric of diplomacy with China is they kind of like, because again, the East Timor was such a small state country, so they have to deal with the different like they have to deal with diplomacies with a different country, whether Australia, China, so they can use the Chinese card when they talk with Australia or when they talk to Japan. Like, well, for instance, Japan would aid some like development aid, but we can just negotiate where China have this deal, what you have, like, you know, that kind of. So I think for East Timorese, I think Ariel could talk about more this point, but my understanding is that East Timor are trying to expand their network, I mean, relationships, and try to use a different kind of diplomatic sources. But yeah, I think Australia is still have predominant effect to Timor-Leste, and Indonesia as well, culturally, economically, and then yeah, because Indonesia is has always like supported the Timorese other missions to the ASEAN membership, so which is kind of that strategy to dominant, relation with Timor-Leste. But I think Australia, Indonesia is quite strong. Where China might be yes somehow, but the thing is, it really depends on how East Timorese politicians or the government try to deal with the diplomatic relations. So, any comment, Ariel and Professor Ying Hooi?
Yeah, so I'm gonna just jump in a little bit of these questions. Yeah, I think I would like to tackle this question from a broader views. I think the concern is really not solely on the Timor-Leste itself, but geopolitically, the Chinese influence can have the impact in the different regions. I think there has been a lot of talks about China and Cambodia. And if we look at it from the IR perspective, Timor and Cambodia has the closest relationships among all the ASEAN member states, in fact. And there have been some evidence of showing this triangular relationship, of course. And I think the concerns was really about the longer terms. I think we have to unpack these questions into how is the implications on the Timorese society, because this is the same thing that being felt by other countries that have strong Chinese influence in terms of, it is really being divided into two. People need Chinese investments, but at the same time, there are also concerns that being made of the long-term implications on that particular countries and also in that particular regions. This is where I draw the attentions of this Indo-Pacific spectrums to actually of this sort of regionalism. Is no longer that we are only talking about Southeast Asia, because in Southeast Asia, we have been facing with a lot of debates between not just US, China, but there are also different emerging powers and regional groupings as well that can actually put on quite a pressures in that particular regions. I think on that alone, I think, yes, there have been some views of even from the Australia side that, okay, there are many different external powers that are being influential in Timor itself, because it's a post-conflict society, it's a small state, it still requires quite a bit of capacities, building assistance, and many other things. But if you read from the different media's analysis, you will see that the strong Chinese influence in particular countries, for this case, if in the case of Timor, you will see the medias coming from the Australia that can have the kind of counter narratives in terms of containing the powers of China in Timor-Leste. So those are some of the quite interesting dynamics that I think being nominated about this in these regions, not only Timor-Leste, but in many other Southeast Asian countries as well.
Thank you very much. I'm still on. No, I mentioned geopolitics, but I deal with soft power, Japanese and Chinese soft power influence across Southeast Asia. So, but I had no clue, I have to admit. Probably I can find something, but I was curious. So thank you very much. Yeah. That one was very insightful.
Ariel, do you have anything to add from your own perspective?
Yeah, no, I'm going to answer that question in a different way. So Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, recently came to Pacific Island Forum. It was like, it was some annual meeting for Pacific Island leaders. And then he just came and say, like, we've forgotten about you and that's bad. And we need to come back. And like, United States need to do a pivot to Pacific. And oftentimes in the US terms, that sort of includes Timor-Leste too, like tangentially, like sometimes, like even though we're not strictly part of Pacific, but that often like resonates, like they tangentially touch on us too. Like the United States government recently, they rehabilitated an airport and in the eastern part of the island. But so there's a lot of like the aid competition in East Timor, right? Like it used to be like China like wanted to give us like loans and aids, and then US was like, we need to outdo that. And then in 2021, United States gave us like but it was the biggest foreign aid we've ever received from the United States government. So the Timor-Leste, from Timor-Leste's foreign policy perspective, we continue to maintain what we call in Portuguese boa vizinhança, like the good neighbor policy. So the government is very cautious not to take sides with anybody, but the major power competition, you can feel that in there too. And the reason why I say that I want to answer your question in a different way is through the perspective of the scholarship, development scholarships. So right now, government of China gives the largest send students from Timor-Leste to China to study. Like they give the most number of scholarships, and the United States see that China is, because I argue that like sometimes like the international students who go to study in other countries, like for us, for Timor-Leste, Timorese students to go to these countries, we just go, we want to pursue the studies, but from the country's perspective, they see these students as ideological instruments as well, because like there are the students, the alumni, the students who study in China, and when they go back, they founded like the association of Timor-Leste students, like alumni from Timor-Leste student alumni in China, and they like really advocated for like a more stronger Timor-Leste relation with China, and how like Xi Jinping is a really great leader. So, and then you see the Timor-Leste students who come to study in the United States, like they sort of like, we need to be like with Australia and the United States. We can't have anything to do with China. So it is sort of like a competition in aid. Like you can see the major power competition through foreign aids, through scholarship, a number of scholarships that they give to students, and Australia as well, giving a lot of scholarship from East Timorese students to study in Australia too. So, and these students, they come back not just with knowledge, and sometimes with some, developing some sort of ideologies, like, consciously or unconsciously. So.
Well, if anything, there will be a recognition ideology, but this is in line actually with what I've seen in other countries. Thank you very much.
If I may add, Taka,
Yep.
building up from Ariel's point, is that I think the Chinese influence in Timor cannot be ignored. And one thing is that if you look at the Chinese vaccine diplomacy, it is very strongly being felt in the Southeast Asia, and it is strongly felt in Timor as well. So Sanana Guzman is the first person who get the Chinese vaccine, and that is soft power, as we see. And so I think those are some of the evidence to show the Chinese influence in Timor, which should be discussed and debated further, rather than to see that, we have other powers like United States and the Australia, Portugal that continue to be there, but China has a different approach in terms of just like what Ariel has mentioned, from the educations, from the things that the Timorese societies might need in the developmental assistance, rather than just solely about everything about democracy and human rights that are rather subjective. So I think those are the things that should be paid emphasis. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, being Japanese, this issue is quite. Practically speaking, we also have this kind of competition between BRI, China's Belt Road Initiative, which kind of accommodating Southeast Asian countries, and then Japan also had this developmental aid to the Asian countries. So that's actually how I saw, even like when I was in Timor, like we have the development like road built by China, and Japanese JICA, Japanese International Corporate Agency, tried to build a new road in different parts. This kind of competition between China and Japan, and then yeah, it's quite. As I said in the Timor-Leste, I think China influence is quite strong, and also oil matters, also money from China, and also culture, we have a Chinese Timorese, right? They have more. They don't speak Chinese, but they are more culturally affiliated to. This is what I heard from one of Timorese scholars. Like, when it comes to influence, we could also say in Timor we have Chinese, like Chinese Timorese, so that's also cultural dimension that we could see. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for your answers. And another question from Luis. I think I can show him to join.
So I'll just briefly ask the question, but first, thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk. I guess from what I can tell, East Timor is in a very tough position now because it's so close to the Pacific Islands, so close to ASEAN. It's not part of either, due to its attempt to try to join ASEAN, but it can't meet those institutional requirements. And maybe culturally, there's an argument to be said that based on its past experience, the development aid, etc., it has probably more in common with some of the Pacific Island states. But frankly, because West Papua is part of Indonesia, it's actually very far away from the rest of the Pacific. And so I guess my question is, you talk about this construction of, whether Timor is part of Southeast Asia, or part of the Pacific or whatever. Do you think Timorese political elites have misled the public a bit to try to create this expectation that they're part of ASEAN, they're part of Southeast Asia, when in reality, at least some ASEAN members, and enough to have a veto, are just so opposed to East Timor's membership because they don't feel like it can meet these institutional requirements, that they've kind of set Timor up to fail in this way, that they've created an expectation that they really can't satisfy in the short or long term. And if Timor really can't meet some of these kind of pretty serious institutional boundaries, I mean, we're talking about having a large enough diplomatic service to send people to ASEAN meetings, and it's not cheap, right? It's not easy for a country of 1 million people to do that. Do you think Timorese political elites should start a conversation to think about, is there maybe an alternative option? Join the PIF, for example, just looking for an associative or observer membership, or, is this a conversation that the people should be having rather than just saying Timor's going to join ASEAN, we'll have to get into heaven somehow? Thanks.
Right, thank you very much for your questions. Daniel, start to first start to answer questions, or any thought?
I mean, I could again take a stab. I was just like writing down my notes. I think from the inside, the government of Timor-Leste says that joining ASEAN is a very strategic decision for economic reasons. And we are the observer member of Pacific Island Forum, and I mean, we for a long time also an observer member in ASEAN and attend both meetings. But because geographically we border with Indonesia, right? Like the western part of East Timor is like belongs to Indonesia, and from geographical and strategic reasons, that the argument is that it is strategic for us as to be part of ASEAN. And yeah, so it the rejection, like the membership, like I don't know, like rejection for lack of better term, or like the stall, like the delay, is something that the government has not been able to answer. Is that something that we need? Like it's something that they like annually keep submitting membership, and then like asking ASEAN countries and establishing the embassies in all 10 ASEAN countries, and really like like prioritize, and then there's like a fact-finding mission that the envoys from ASEAN is supposed to come and see that we're really doing all of the things we say we do, and it's it is a really hard work that like, and then the people sort of just have to endure with the government and like patiently waiting. But I think because ASEAN last year they have agreed, like the language agreement principle, like agree in principle that to accept us as the 11th member of ASEAN. The hope is that this year we're going to be part of ASEAN because Indonesia is the chair of ASEAN right now, and Indonesia is one of our, ironically, even though historically we have tensions, but ironically Indonesia is actually our biggest supporter of to enter ASEAN. So like with Indonesia's chairmanship this year, people are really hoping that this is the year that we're joining ASEAN. And yeah, and I was just, when we were just talking about this, one thing I texted, I WhatsApp my friends from home and I said, is Bahasa Indonesia, or the Indonesian language, still taught in school? And they say yes. And I remember, so I graduated from high school in 2013. So that was 11 years after independence. And Bahasa Indonesia is taught for 2 years in high school. And the reason, and like we always just like, we're already getting independence, like why we still have to learn Indonesian? And they used the reason, the Ministry of Education said that because Bahasa Indonesia or Bahasa Indonesia, or like, like Melayu, like Malay language, is like sort of a working language of ASEAN. It's just, and they tell the students like this is gonna be like a official language of ASEAN, so you need to continue learning Indonesian. And so it is, and it's still in 2023, like students have to still learn Indonesian for 2 years in school for that reason. So, you know, we've come a long way, and there's no plan to back out.
If I may just add up to the discussions, I think certainly that language is one of the fascinating things that happening in Timor, because the same questions can go back to why should Portuguese becomes the one of the language as well, so apart from Bahasa Indonesia. So I think all this opens up to what is questions about the political elites that driving the agenda, and the lack of maybe, I think education is really one of the things that is lacking in Timor-Leste itself, in building up, in bridging the gap of people understanding about ASEAN, as well as why is joining ASEAN is important. And it is not solely for economic reasons. In fact, it is very important for security reasons as well, and for many other security issues, without being in part of one of the regions that you geographically very close to. It actually becomes one of the hindrance that you can only do things bilaterally, but multilaterally, it has become quite a hindrance in many other things, as well as I think if we talk about socially, also is being losing out of many opportunities, because if a relatively new country is not expanding regionally, it loses out for the opportunities for its own societies as well. I think that is also one part of that. But what's also very interesting is that when the ASEAN leaders released a statement in November 2022 about admitting Timor-Leste as, in principle, as the ASEAN members, there was actually, I observed that there were very little enthusiastics or even celebrating about Timor-Leste finally somehow one step closer to ASEAN, which is a very interesting dynamics that, you know, rather that is the reasons why I put out the poster from Indonesia. I can't find any from Timor, but rather I find the more of a celebration coming from outside rather than inside. That actually quite interesting observations in which I also, because Facebook is the main medium, social media mediums generally in that being used in Timor quite popularly, also coming from the government as well, from the ministries. If you look at the ministries of foreign affairs pages that regarding the ASEAN, you will see the congratulatory message actually coming from Cambodia. It's not really coming from Timorese themselves or any other countries. So all those kind of things are quite interesting to being put up together to actually really extend the discussion being put forward by Moise about political elites driving the agenda of Timor joining the ASEAN. Yet there are a lot of things that internally has to be improved and fixed, at the same time coming from ASEAN as well, of course, to actually enable these two entities, one regional and one Timor-Leste, to actually try and bridge the gaps that as much as they could in the longer term. Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, both of you. I just this can add. I'm not very sure how much because the culture, political culture in ASEAN is quite difficult to define. But what I could see is, we have also this transition, internal transition in Timor-Leste, where the Portuguese educated leaders will be retiring soon, and then the new generation, so-called new generation, Hong, we called it in Tetum. But those who educate during the Indonesian occupations, they go to the school in Indonesia, study in Bali, Jakarta, Yogyakarta, came back to the Timor-Leste, East Timor after the independence, became politicians, NGOs, directors. So those people, I think, more like culturally Indonesians, I would say, because they also fight against Suharto regime with Indonesian activists. And during my time in Timor, I attended a couple of conferences in Dili, like which NGO people come together, and actually they speak Bahasa Indonesia, not Tetun. This is quite interesting. I think because there are some Indonesian speakers there, but entire discussion conversation in NGO avenue is Bahasa. And now those people who are active in NGO or grassroots avenue show up in the political stage and became like a candidate or president or politician, parliamentarian. So I think those generations more like Southeast Asian oriented as their struggle of independence over in 1990s were more associated with the struggle of Indonesians, also other Philippines, like other Southeast Asian countries. So given that, I think we could see perhaps more like shift to the more ASEAN side, given that the new generation of political leader Timor-Leste maybe become more active in actual politics. So, but yeah, that might be quite interesting. I mean, language, also cultural influence between Portugal and Indonesia is kind of really interesting implication to see how East Timorese relation to ASEAN will go well or go bad in next decade. So yeah. Thank you very much for your questions. Any other question from audience so far? No. Right, I think it's time has come. Yes. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. So we Center for Geopolitics, both in person and online conference regularly. Our new launch, the Indo-Pacific. I don't really want to say the Indo-Pacific. It's kind of like it's still controversial within my group, but like Indo-Pacific program had quite many talk, and this time we focus on ASEAN and Timor-Leste. But we also have a kind of broader topic on China, Japan, East Asia, also other countries in Southeast Asia. So if you're really interested, you can follow us in Twitter and also LinkedIn, and we can visit our website to see the upcoming event as well. Again, thank you for coming, and thank you for great speaker, both of you joining our panel today. And I hope you have a good day and a good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.